Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council's meeting to review and discuss the interagency technical report on sea level rise for 2020. I'm CJ Reynolds. I'm the Director of Resiliency and Engagement. I'll be introducing our speakers in the agenda in a bit. I just wanted to go over some of the basic housekeeping. I know all of you have been doing this for 2 years, but it just never hurts. So this meeting is being recorded. We will post the presentations on our website as well as the overall webinar today. If you have any technical difficulties, please send us a chat. We can always find a way for you to call in. We ask that because there's so many of you on the line today, it's a great turnout for this important topic. If you please keep your microphone muted and then type any comments and questions into the chat window. This is really important. This is really one of the things we wanted to do today was collect input from you, and we'll go through that. And then also raise your hand icon so we can call on you later. I've attempted to set up a Jamboard which will enable us to also put in some maybe more comments, and we'll use that as we go forward. So make sure I've got my screen going here. Oh, there we go. So today's agenda, I'm pleased to introduce to you some really significant people in the region working on resilience. First and foremost is our Executive Director, Sean Sullivan. I'll be going through the goals and overview of today and some of the background on the coalition and things along those lines. Then we have Heidi Stiller from the NOAA Office for Coastal Management to give us that review and a demo of the tools that they've also produced. And to bring us up to speed on the Florida Flood Hub and state sea level rise initiatives. We also have Professor Gary Mitchum with the University of South Florida College of Marine Science. Then we'll have questions and discussions, also conversations with the two co-leads of the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel, who many of you know, who's Libby Carnahan with Sea Grant, IFAS Extension, and Maya Burke at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Also joining me on the webinar is Kara Serra, who's our Comprehensive Resilience Planner, and other staff, the Regional Planning Council. So before I turn it over to Sean, I just want to say thank you to everyone who signed up. This is, we had something more like 140 to 150 people who include everything from FDOT staff, FDP, resiliency leads from other counties and RPCs, as well as a strong turnout from private sector engineering firms, sea level rise consultants, and who are working on these things, as well as many of the Resilience Coalition members, the local government staff who are working on everything from outfall assessment, stormwaters, to large-scale vulnerability assessments. And this is really, a great opportunity for us to come together, hear information together firsthand, and go forward. So, as I mentioned, this is being recorded. Also, we're excited that we have several members of the media are attending as well to learn through this. So we welcome your comments and questions, and please feel free to keep us posted. We'll keep going through this as we go. So Sean, I want to turn it over to you to say a few words, and then I can go through the PowerPoint with some background for the folks who aren't really familiar with the region.
Great, thank you, CJ. And welcome everyone. Thank you for your participation this afternoon in this webinar format, Zoom meeting really, that we find is going to be very important to the Tampa Bay region. Particularly, I would like to thank our presenters this afternoon for taking your time to put a PowerPoint together and participate in this very important discussion. So welcome. I'm going to put a shameless plug in now for the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council's Resiliency Summit, which will be held April 5th and 6th at the Hilton Carillon in St. Pete. You could check out our website for details and registration at tbrpc.org. Many of you may recall this will be our second Regional Resiliency Leadership Summit, the first being in 2020. COVID kind of threw us a curveball. We didn't have a summit last year, but we're really excited about the program that we've put together. We've got some very interesting topics and participation, particularly in the second day when we do the breakout panels. So I encourage your participation, not only today, but please consider registering for our Resiliency Summit, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. We appreciate that. He has to go do some interviews as well. The report seems to have stimulated a lot of media attention on sea level rise, and for that, which we are very, very appreciative to help educate all of the residents and business owners in the region. So for those of you who are not that familiar with the Regional Planning Council, our mission statement is to serve citizens, member governments by providing a forum to foster communications, coordination, and collaboration in identifying and addressing needs regionally. And so this really perfectly sums up how we think about these challenging issues and new emerging information that come through that, which is sea level rise and climate changes and impacts as well. So, all right. Why do I keep, there we go. So the exactly this year, the Tampa Bay Region Planning Council has been convening the region for 60 years. It's our 60th anniversary, working on flood issues and climate resiliency for more than a decade. A lot of regional economic analysis, emergency management. So the hurricane guides over the years, Hurricane Phoenix, to help educate people on how these things are impacting us. A lot of collaboration and environmental stewardship, and as well as analysis and convening on transportation. Now, these topics have continued to expand and become more nuanced, and other things, for example, such as affordable housing and resiliency, in additionally looking at these issues as we go forward. So, who we serve, the Regional Planning Council now includes counties from as far north as Citrus and down to Manatee County, and 21 municipalities within that. So it's different from the Regional Resilience Coalition. The coalition itself also includes the same boundary counties, but also includes Sarasota, who joined us, and additional municipalities. We're now up to 32 local governments. Our colleagues in Pinellas Park were the most recent ones to join, and it's a really great group of people who've been working together, and the staff providing us through advice through the Management Planning Committee. We're also advised and led through the Resilience Steering Committee, which includes the elected officials of a number of these counties and cities. And overall, Commissioner Janet Long, who's Pinellas County Commissioner, was really the catalyst of this during her year as chair of the Regional Planning Council, and continues to be extremely active in advancing the Resilience Coalition initiatives, and is a big champion of the summit and other activities on infrastructure to housing as well. And we have additional members who are taking a greater lead in, as well, in ideas relating to smaller cities and communities and other specialized things. So we're very appreciative of the steering committee members that are active on this. So one of the things that when I started here as well, Kara and I just started 3 years ago, one of the things that we were fortunate to be able to build on was the work that was done by the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel. The group, which includes Libby's groups and Maya, developed, and this is actually the second updated document, developed recommended projections of sea level rise, how to interpret and look at the NOAA 2017 information. I just wanted to share this as a background, how important this document was for the region, for the local governments, because this was issued prior to the state establishing a statute of sea level rise scenarios, what to look at, how to use them. And so this was a great foundational document for us. And so this is why we really welcome the opportunity to hear from the beginning where the interagency report is at. And now I'm going to be able to turn it over to Heidi so she can start sharing her screen. And I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and then we'll hear from Heidi. We think we can take a few questions with that, but we know that we can go through a lot. So we want to go through everybody and then be able to take a lot of deep dive and discussions as we go forward. So we'll keep track of the chats on that. And now I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Heidi.
Thanks, CJ. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right, has that come up?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity today. It's always a pleasure when I get asked to speak here locally. I'm based in St. Pete, and I really like it when I have an opportunity to engage in the resilience conversation here in the Tampa Bay area. So as
one thing, can you click on presentation mode? Because we see all your other things, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, I'm gonna stop my video because once I click on presentation, I won't be able to see you. And so CJ, I will ask that if there's anything that comes in the chat that I should address, just stop me.
Okay.
All right, did it go full screen?
Not yet.
All right, I think I may share my other screen. Apologies, y'all. The fun thing about PowerPoint. How about now?
I am not seeing it yet. We're still seeing my old screen. No, we're just seeing everybody on here. Try it one more time.
I'm gonna try one more time. All right, now watch it again.
Nope.
Now. Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's good now. You're good.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
We practiced. I thought we had it. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for having me today. As CJ mentioned, I am going to speak to this new report, the Interagency Sea Level Rise Technical Report for 2022. So I wanted to start off just talking about, what is it and who was involved. So this is an interagency report that is produced by a wealth of agencies. You can see all the logos up here that form the Interagency Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flood Hazard Scenarios and Tools Task Force. And the goal here is really to provide the most up-to-date sea level rise projections available for all U.S. states and territories. And this report serves as a key input to the National Climate Assessment. The 5th National Climate Assessment is underway right now. And so the 2022 report will inform that assessment, just as the 2017 technical report informed the last National Climate Assessment. And then beyond the climate assessment, the report really aims to support providing accessible and usable sea level rise and coastal flood hazard information for all types of users: federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and territorial efforts. So the 2022 technical report actually is a little bit broader than the 2017, and it includes sort of 3 pieces of information this time around. The first piece is updated sea level rise scenarios at global, US, regional, and local levels. And this piece is the piece that I'll spend the most time on today and really focus on. The second piece is an observation trend and extrapolation. And so what was done here is that the scientists and modelers looked at the observation information from 1970 to 2020, and then they extrapolated that out to look at projections for 2020 to 2050. The third piece of information that's included in the technical report, and this is one that we won't have time to get into today very much, but it is new information about the probabilities or frequencies of extreme water levels of various heights. So not just storm surges, but how often are we going to have high tide flooding events? And then, of course, the report itself does include extensive description of the scientific data and methods that were employed. So there are some key takeaways from the report, and some of these you all have probably seen in the media coverage. The first one is that sea level along our U.S. coastlines will rise about 10 to 12 inches on average over the next 30 years. And it's important to note that that is an average figure for the U.S. as a whole. And those amounts do vary around our coastline, and I'll speak to that in a little bit. The other point within this is that this much rise is the same amount that we've had over the last 100 years, which really illustrates the acceleration in sea level rise that we have already seen. Second key takeaway is really about how sea level rise doesn't act alone, right? So sea level rise will exacerbate the impacts of episodic flooding events from extreme tides and from storm surges. And then the conclusion from sort of that exacerbation is that we will really see a shift in our coastal flooding over the next 30 years. NOAA sets different thresholds for flooding so they can think about what's minor, moderate, and major. And the research shows that by 2050, what's today considered a moderate flooding event that does include some damage will be occurring more than 10 times as often as it does today. Another key takeaway is that emissions matter. And right now, with just current emissions, we're slated to have at least 2 feet of additional sea level rise being increasingly likely by 2100. But if we fail to curb future emissions, that could cause a rise upwards of 7 feet by the end of the century. Another key takeaway is that this report is different from 2017. And compared to that previous report, there is greater certainty about what is likely in the near term, so in those next 30 years. But the uncertainty in the scenarios does increase after 2050, and it is highly dependent on future emissions. And that's really important to think about for our planning purposes, right? And thinking about whether we're planning for something short-term or long-term. And then finally, it's just the need to keep doing the science, right? And continued observations and modeling of all of the contributors to sea level rise will really allow us to make the predictions even better. I did want to take a minute just to touch on the causes of sea level rise. I know many of you have probably been over this, so I will try to make it brief. But globally, sea level rise is caused by these 2 factors that you see: thermal expansion of ocean waters and ice loss from glaciers and ice sheets. But at the regional level, there's additional factors that come into play, and that's why the rate of rise is different around the country. The first factor is stereodynamics, which is talking about the ocean's movement, so the currents and circulation patterns out there, and its climate, so changes in temperature and salinity. The second factor is vertical land motion. This is one that I think a lot of us in the Gulf are pretty familiar with because there are some places in the Gulf with dramatic vertical land motion. But this is about the fact that the land is rising or sinking in different parts of our country. In Alaska, for example, parts of Alaska, the land is actually rising as compared to the Mississippi Delta, where the land is sinking pretty dramatically due to subsidence. And then finally, something called gravitational, rotational, and deformational changes. And this is really about changes in land ice and the solid earth. So when ice sheets and glaciers melt or lose their mass, this adds fresh water to the oceans and changes the gravity, deformation, and rotation of our Earth. And that contributes to higher sea level rise at locations farther away from the ice melting sources. And so this pattern of sea level rise is known as fingerprinting. You may hear people use that term about sea level rise fingerprints. And it's the reason that ice mass loss from distant Antarctica will impact our US coastlines more than ice mass loss from Greenland. So the issue of which ice sheet we're talking about is actually really important for where effects end up happening. So this is a graphic from the sea level rise report that just illustrates this reality that the rate is relative and we have different rates of rise around the country. You can see the intermediate low scenario on the left and then intermediate high on the right. And as I mentioned, you can see how that Mississippi Delta area has exceptionally high rates of sea level rise due to that subsidence. So what are sea level rise scenarios? They are a set of possible future sea level changes, and they are created based on various predictions of greenhouse gas emissions and ocean and atmospheric warming projections. And what they do is incorporate uncertainty related to our understanding of sea level change processes, so process uncertainty, as well as the uncertainty around what's going to happen with future emissions and their impacts, and that's known as emissions uncertainty. So a lot of folks have been asking me, how are the 2022 scenarios different from 2017? And so I did want to speak to that specifically. So the same nomenclature is being used for scenarios, so the low, intermediate low, intermediate high, high. Those same terms and scenarios are being used. However, the extreme scenario was dropped in the 2022 technical report. The global scenario projections for 2100 stayed the same, but the timing changed. And so what we see is, and what the science shows, is that the prediction is for less acceleration in those scenarios until later in this century. So it's a slower rate of rise between now and 2050. And both the removal of the extreme scenario and that new time pathway and slower rate of rise early in the century, those are directly tied to advances in our scientific understanding. And they have a lot of support in the scientific literature and in the International Panel on Climate Change 6 report. Another aspect of the report, as I mentioned, is those extrapolated observations. Those are provided at the regional level. And there is a tool that NASA has showing them for tide gauges that I'll mention just briefly. But that does help us get a greater understanding of potential future sea level trends in the near term. So a few words about where you can find all of this. And as CJ mentioned, these slides will be posted and shared afterwards, so you'll have access to all of the links in here. And there's a link here for the main landing page, and that's a NOAA page that serves up the report itself. If you want to go read the various sections of the report, there is a frequently asked questions set in there that I highly recommend. It has some really good plain language explanation of some of this. There's a podcast where you can hear from the tech report authors about the data. You can also get access directly to the data and then to the tools that I'll mention below. And just a note, there is access to the data, and the data will be used by oceanographers, data scientists, GIS developers, and you can get a raw CSV file for those of you that are equipped to handle that raw data. But one of my NOAA office partners has also developed an API URL builder that makes it a lot easier to sort of query what you want and get a URL link to it to adjust in your own tools. There are 4 tools that I'll mention that are really aiming to help planners, floodplain managers, stormwater engineers, public works folks, local officials, coastal resource managers access the information and visualize what the information is going to mean for our communities. And these first 2 are ones that I'm going to try and do a brief demo of today. The first tool is the Digital Coast Sea Level Rise Viewer. I suspect many of you on the line today are familiar with this tool. It has been out for a while now, but we have updated it to show the 2022 scenario information. The second tool NASA developed, which is a sea level rise scenario tool, and it provides a variety of information about the 2022 scenarios and report, and I will show that one. And then Adapting Stormwater Management for Coastal Floods is a tool that allows users to set a threshold and then see when that threshold of flooding is going to be exceeded under different sea level rise scenarios. It also has been updated to include the 2022 scenarios, but you can still pick 2017 as well. And then finally, we have Coastal County Snapshots as one of our Digital Coast products, and we have added a new snapshot focused on sea level rise. One final product that is going to be coming this spring is an applications guide. And so how this came about is that some of the folks working on the ground and extension and engagement were engaging with the technical report authors and worried that the report itself was going to be, pretty darn technical, and thinking that we could really use a piece that would help folks apply this on the ground. And so a subgroup of the technical report authors and a group of extension and engagement professionals have been co-developing an application guide, and I expect that will be out, I hope, in the next 2 months. And this guide is going to speak to several different approaches for integrating the sea level rise projections, a risk tolerance approach, so sort of thinking about different sorts of assets and how long they need to last influences your risk tolerance, and that might influence what scenario you choose. A scenario planning approach where you look at impacts and what will happen under different scenarios to sort of plan for different futures. and an adaptation pathways approach, which I think about as sort of a stepwise approach where you think about sort of near-term things that don't preclude you from then doing additional adaptation strategies when certain thresholds get passed. So we'll speak to those 3 different approaches in that guide. And then finally, just one more resource I want to mention is our coastal inundation topics page on Digital Coast. There'll be a link to that in the slides. But this is a place where we have also really tried to gather available resources for getting the data, for visualizing it, for how to communicate it. There's some risk communication resources in there, and then also getting into strategies to adapt. So I am going to stop sharing the PowerPoint here in a second and try to do a couple of demos, but I did want to provide my contact information here. Always happy to chat with folks by phone or shoot me questions by email. All right, I'm going to close out of this.
All right. Thank you, Heidi. I would like for us to go right to Gary. We'll keep the questions at the end, and I just have to step away
I think Heidi's finished yet, CJ.
Pardon? Oh, you're going to do the demos. Sorry.
Yeah.
Is that all right, CJ?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Do you see the cover page for the Sea Level Rise viewer?
Yes.
Great. All right. So I think a lot of you are familiar with the Sea Level Rise viewer, but it is a national tool. And so you zoom in to your local area. So I'm zooming right in to our local area. And then over here, I'm going to pick local scenarios and choose the St. Pete tide gauge. Let me move this map over so we can see a little bit better. All right. So what we're seeing here is the 2022 sea level rise scenario projection information over here on the left. And this tool allows you to look by scenario or by year. Right now we're looking by scenario, so this is 2022. And if you look at the intermediate high projection, this gives you those projections over here on the left-hand side. So we can see that by 2060, the intermediate high projection is for 1.94 feet of sea level rise. So that's about 2 feet, right? And so I will use the little slider bar here to go up to 2 feet. And that allows us to visualize what that amount of inundation would look like for our area. So that's the basic functionality of the viewer. Up here, you can switch from 2022 to 2017. And then we have a new, or the old set of numbers rather, here intermediate high, 2060 was 2.62 feet. So this is just an illustration that the 2017 projections were a little bit higher than 2022. I'm going to switch a little bit and also show you by year. If we look by year, so right now this is set to 2050. And you can see that all of the projections, right, are pretty close together in this near-term period, with the intermediate low being 1.05 feet, intermediate high 1.61. So the range has narrowed. And so I'm going to bring it down to just one for this time. But if we change our year and we go up to say 2090, then you can see that there's a much bigger range between the scenarios, right? And that was what I talked about, how there's more certainty about the near term, whereas when we get past 2050, there's a lot more uncertainty about what might happen. And so this is an illustration of the range of possible scenarios getting wider as you go further out. All right, I'm going to switch over to the NASA tool, and I know I'm going very quickly. But you all will have the link so you can go back to these tools, and I'm always happy to do a demo in the future too, if anybody wants one. So the NASA tool, similar to the NOAA tool, starts you out at this national level, and you need to zoom in. So I'll zoom in to our area. It's easy to get. The NASA tool has both grid grid points and tide gauges. So it's sometimes a trick to get me to the tide gauge. Let's see. There we go. So you pick the St. Pete tide gauge. And what you get on this cover page is just sort of you can pick on the left what you want to see, but the default is an intermediate projection for 2100. And I will note that the NASA tool provides everything in meters, as opposed to the sea level rise viewer I just showed. You can look at it in feet or meters, but everything on the NASA tool is in meters, and it's only the 2022 information. You can't go back and forth between 2017 and 2022. If you choose full projection, you get sort of a report pops up for your tide gauge or your grid point. And there's 3 components that you receive in this report. The first component is that you can see the sea level rise scenarios, and you can also see the likely ranges. And so this helps us understand that it's not a set number, right? What you see in the line is the median, but then there's a range, a likely range around that shows it's the 17th to 83rd percentile. That's explained up here at the top. But it just is a reminder that there is uncertainty around these scenarios. And the NASA tool allows you to turn on and off different pieces. So maybe you want to just look at intermediate and intermediate high. You can do that. The other piece that you can do in this tool is to look at the observation extrapolation I mentioned. That only goes to 2050. And so you can switch your graphics so you're looking at just that time period. And on here you can see the tide gauge record, and then you can see the extrapolated obs. But when it's combined with everything else, it's very hard to see. So I'm going to turn off some of these scenarios. And so what you can see now is the intermediate low scenario and its likely range. And then you can also see the observation extrapolation. And I wanted to show this so you can see that the observation extrapolation overlaps with multiple scenarios, right? So it doesn't tell us this is the one, right? I think that's a really important point. All right, the second thing you get in this NASA tool is the table. We're all used to seeing these tables. And this just shows you decade by decade, the projections for the different scenarios for your selected tide gauge. And then the last thing in the NASA tool is this graphic showing individual process contributions. And I think this is really neat. And what they did is they tried to show the different factors. We talked a little bit before about those factors that contribute to sea level rise. And this shows how they contribute to the different scenarios over time. So what we see right now is 2030. So this is, very near term. And 2 factors are really big drivers: the vertical land motion, and then that stereodynamic sea level rise. So what's happening with our ocean currents and temperatures. But if we go further out in time, I'm going to switch to the year 2090. We see that the contributions have really shifted, and the big ice sheets, so Greenland and Antarctica, are a much bigger factor as we get later out in determining, which scenario we will be on. So I think this is just a really neat way to visualize those different factors, and urge you to take the time to check out the tools further. And with that, I will stop sharing so we can turn it to Gary.
Gary, we'll have you take it away.
No, thank you all. Thank you, Heidi. That was a great summary. Since Heidi's given you kind of the large scale look, the all around the United States down to the region, but the federal report, I wanted to start off by just saying that one of the things that I believe in very strongly is that we need to do our assessments and our planning on a tiered sort of level. the global analysis the IPCC does informs our national analysis, which Heidi's just summarized for you. That in turn should inform the state level sort of analysis, which then informs the Tampa Bay and the South Florida, the Jacksonville, informs those areas. None of these should be considered prescriptive. These are information that we then fine tune and use as we think best in the regions. And even from the Tampa Bay region, for example, different municipalities may have different needs for assessments and information. So the thing that I'm going to talk about today, CJ asked me, kind of representing here the Florida Flood Hub, which a lot of people probably don't know much about yet, mainly because it's just getting started. But this is the one that's going to try to produce that statewide, state level sort of assessment. And so you can think of it as a downscaling of this federal national tool, but I think we're going to try to do a little bit more than that. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But first of all, I'm going to share a few slides that are just going to tell you a little bit about the Flood Hub. As I said, though, this thing is just now being stood up, so I don't have a lot of detail for you, but I can give you kind of a broad brush idea of what's going on. Okay, so the Florida Flood Hub, this was created in the legislature, the Resiliency Act in 2021. So in principle, it was created last July, but in practice, you know how things work. We actually have a contract and funding in place as of 2 weeks ago. So we have our first report is due in June. So of course we're behind the guns, but we're just getting started with all of this. The idea here is that we're going to be looking at flooding risk, amongst other things. I'll turn to that in a moment, due to a variety of causes, not just the sea level rise that we've been talking about today, but also rainfall events, the extreme rainfall, storm surge. The extreme events fall into a number of categories, some due to rainfall, some due to the high tide flooding, some due to storm surge events. And stormwater enters it because, of course, if you can't drain off the rain, then you have a flood. So all of those kind of things we lump together as being flooding risk as opposed to sea level rise risk. And so hence the name, the Flood Hub. This is just a quote of a portion now, a portion of what the Flood Hub is responsible for to the state. We're mandated to do these things. And you can read through this when you look at the summary before. The main point I want to make right now is that we have a very wide ranging set of things that we need to address. The one that I'm going to talk about first, in terms of, there's a big red letters up here, draft plan. This is our best guess right now about how we're going to set this thing up. This is not done yet, and it will evolve, I'm certain. But the main thing is I want to point to this lower left-hand side. In terms of doing the science input, the technical inputs to this group, we're going to work in terms of a set of working groups. Working group 1 is the one that's going to be dealing with the sea level rise projections and some of the other flooding risk, the high tide flooding, for example. That group has been created. I'm going to be chairing it, and we have our report is due in June. So that's the one that's making me lose sleep at night since we haven't even started yet. And we're playing off of the national report, which just came out 2 weeks ago. So, but we'll get it done, and that's what we're working on now. And I don't want to, okay. So I stopped sharing my screen. So I hope, I just wanted to talk to you for a few minutes now. I wanted to keep this short because in order to leave as much time as possible for questions and comments and discussion. So just a few points to play off of what Heidi was talking about. Again, the sea level rise scenarios that we're showing here, you can click on a point anywhere in the world based on these things, in St. Petersburg, the examples that Heidi showed you. But you have to remember, these are based on global models. You can interpolate them down to a 1 meter resolution if you like, but it's still based on global information. And so when we talk about downscaling, we need to really carefully assess, first of all, how well does it apply? And one thing in the national report that I was not keen on at all was when they split the country up into different regions. And so half of Florida fell into the Eastern Gulf region and half of Florida fell into the Southeastern region, different numbers, and the state split straight in two. And the regional average, for example, the sea level rise rate in St. Petersburg, we were averaging in the Mississippi Delta land motion rates. So I think they're biased, and we, the Flood Hub, the group that I'm working with, we're going to redo the entire analysis around the state of Florida. So I think it will be a value added product. As I said, we use the global to inform the national, we use the national to inform the state, and then hopefully my product will inform you all. And so to do a further refinement of the information. Another thing I want to talk to you about in particular, this is a little bit technical, and I apologize, but I'm a technical sort of guy. So the tide gauge analysis, Heidi described it very well and made the point to you extremely properly that we cannot use these to choose a scenario, to say which scenario we're on. The report actually explicitly says that. I was one of the reviewers for the report, and I begged them to put that language in. So fortunately they did. And because of the overlap in the scenarios, there's another more subtle issue here too, is that the tide gauge projection, if it doesn't fall in the intermediate scenario, that indicates a problem with either the projection, the global projection, or the tide gauge. It doesn't mean you can choose a scenario. It's really the opposite, that you can't trust them there. So one of the big things that I put in the work plan for the Flood Hub group is to redo a very careful analysis of all the tide gauges in Florida that were used in here. And so we're well on the way of doing that. And finally, I just want to reiterate again, the land motion at the 2050 horizon, the land motion is an extremely important contributor. That along with the stereodynamics thing. So we're also going to have another really careful look at land motion on a finer scale around the state of Florida, using a variety of tools there, and hopefully be able to refine the land motion. Because I'll tell you, my first kind of eyeball look at the numbers that we're getting around here, I think there seem to be a bit high on the land motion, to be honest. So at any rate, that's all I wanted to say. That's what the Flood Hub's going to do. I wish I had results to show you, but as I said, we're under the gun, but just getting started. So thank you, CJ.
Great, thank you. So Gary, I have just a couple of questions for you before then we go to Libby and Maya. There's a couple of questions in the chat. So can you, what's the time frame for doing the modeling for the Florida thing? You mentioned this to you and I when we talked in a previous meeting.
Our first report from this working group 1 has to be delivered by July 1st.
And that will
to the
be
legislature, and it's delivered to the chief science officer, who is an ex officio member of our group. So he will be informed about what we're doing. But I do have that deadline. Of course, we're not going to be able to do everything by that time. So, but that's okay, because this is actually going to be an annual report. So the national report is done every 5 years, but we're going to be reassessing and reevaluating, hopefully not changing, but reassessing, especially the ranges every year. So this first report will not be a do all and end all. In the second year, what my group is doing is in the second year, we're going to say, okay, what do we need to address to improve on what we did last year to provide more information, not different information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question about from Chris. Will the Flood Hub make use of the data sets from SwiftMud's watershed management plans?
We're going to, for this particular working group that I'm on, that I'm leading, we will be using primarily the tide gauge and the sea level rise projection scenarios and I'm going to include the altimetry data, which was not used in the national report. So we're going to be doing that. There are other working groups that are addressing different aspects of the flooding problem, and those will be using the data you're talking about as well, as long with anything we can get. Now, I'm much more of a data person than a model person, so any data I can get, I'd love to look at.
Thanks, Gary. And then one last question, maybe we can put it into the chat. Alan Vittlecom from Pasco is interested in learning more about land motion components. So maybe that's a thing we can collect some information on and follow up on. So excellent.
Alan, if you'd like to set up a call, I'll be happy to talk to you about it anytime.
Okay, very good. So now I wanted to bring up Libby Carnahan and Maya Burke, just to give a sort of a brief recap of or explanation of CSAP and the processes that they have used in the past and some thoughts about what they might be doing going forward with this information.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Okay,
Yes.
well, thank you very much, CJ and Sean and the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council for putting this important meeting together. As CJ has mentioned, myself and Maya are facilitators of the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel. This formed in 2014, kind of right at a time where we were getting this kind of amount of requests for information started to come in from cities and counties about sea level rise. And so we formed a group that is ad hoc. Everyone volunteers their time and their organization's time. And we meet, you know, dependingly, sometimes we'll meet monthly, sometimes we'll meet quarterly, depending on the issues. But our membership is very wide ranging, representing professionals and experts in the Tampa Bay region, such as Gary Mitchum, who you saw as a master academic of sea level rise studies, and Heidi Stiller, who is with NOAA and brings to us that wealth of information from the federal level. Then we also have local agencies like the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Tampa Bay Water, and we did not immediately add the private sector, but a couple of years later, we realized that that was a missing component. So we've added some of our key consultants who are familiar, have been working on Tampa Bay really ecology for, you know, over 3 decades, and understanding how it exists today will help us understand how climate change and sea level rise will change it in the future. So our main objective with all of these experts was really just to support local governments as they plan for a changing climate. At that time in 2014, very few governments had anyone hired that was considered a sustainability or resiliency or climate officer. We don't have the numbers yet, but the RPC is working on a survey for the members of the Regional Resiliency Coalition. And I believe that we will see that quite a few positions have been added. We've kind of catalyzed this larger movement in the Tampa Bay region, and now there's a lot more people involved, and we appreciate that, and just, you know, coordinating with everyone as we move forward to maximize benefit and minimize duplication, and of course make sure that accurate climate science is integrated into resilience planning for the future, because we're not planning for the future as we plan for the past any longer. When the Regional Planning Council came together to form the Regional Coalition in 2018, in the Memorandum of Understanding, the Climate Science Advisory Panel was listed as the entity to follow the sea level rise recommendation that had been created in 2015 and updated in 2019. And just so you know, our recommendations are based on the science that was presented today. We've used the National Climate Assessment for the past 2 recommendations. And, you know, now that this new science is out, it's something that we will look at. And so I'm going to turn it over to Maya to talk about, you know, how we look at new science, and we'll plan and integrate this into the plan.
So the Tampa Bay Climate Science group is your panel of experts. We're here to help wade through the thick and heavy science that you don't have time in your day-to-day life to really wade through and understand, and distill it in a way that you can trust and that's meaningful for the work that you do as a planner, as a private consultant, or an adaptation professional in general. And as you might be picking up from the webinar today, there are a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to just provide a service for you. So we do have new data that we could look at as a group, as a panel, and update the regional recommended projection of sea level rise for the Tampa Bay area. But there's also some potential value to waiting to see what comes out of the Florida Flood Hub, to make sure that, you know, we're working in a stepwise fashion through all of these processes, so the science is flowing from an international level to a federal level to a state level back down to a regional perspective. But really, like, this is one of those key intervening moments when we have a new technical report that's going to be informing the next national climate assessment. And we work to serve you all. And so this is really the part of the meeting that it becomes a discussion in terms of opening this process back so that it's bi-directional. So we're not just putting out a recommendation and telling you to use it. We want to know what you need, what's working for you with the current recommendations, what ought to be incorporated into a future recommendation, what are your expectations in terms of timing, how to function with the state and all of the new guidance that's coming from the state level as well. So I don't want to talk a whole lot more. I want to just sort of set that up as the teaser, and then, you know, kind of open this up for some discussion in terms of what we want to do now that we're beginning to get this new information trickling down as a region. How can we speak with one voice to make sure that our people, our place, and our property are all protected from sea level change?
Well, thank you, Maya. That's a great way to get the conversation started. So thanks for sharing your screen here. So I'm going to invite everyone to turn on their screens so we can see y'all. And there's some good comments that came. Thank you, Jason Bird. You always bring such a deep technical perspective to these workshops and webinars. We appreciate you know, Jacob's participation in many of the work groups. So I want to bring this up, and this is a big thing. So one of the things I think we can see is that there are still a lot of questions about how to take the data. What are the components that we want to do? So who's doing vulnerability assessments? What are we using? So Jason, I'm going to ask you to just make your comment, and then Heidi's already given a response to that. I think that's helpful. And then we'll talk to Brandon next.
Sure. Thank you, CJ. So just my comment was really just in trying to understand, I guess, what opportunities there might be within some of these fantastic online tools to allow some user inputs to the baseline so that the projections can be automatically calculated within the tool based on the baseline of your choice. Because I mean, I understand the reason for the baselines that are there based on a variety of IPCC and other studies and reports, and the data analysis, as Heidi was suggesting in her comment response. However, when we apply the projections for project design or policy, we often have to make those corrections based on the current year so that we're applying appropriate sea level rise projections, not projections from 20 years ago. And it's something that always sparks a heated debate among, you know, various clients to say, but those projections you're showing aren't the published projections. And we're like, yes, we know, because they require correction to you know, to the current year. And because at least I'm not aware of any clear guidance on how best to make those corrections or to communicate them for wide adoption and consistent application, I just welcome this body's input and thoughts and suggestions on, you know, how this is going to play out in the future and how best we can work together to help guide this process.
Heidi or Maya or Gary want to comment on or respond and share some additional thoughts from Jason's comments?
Thanks, CJ. So Jason, I really appreciate raising this. The baseline year is important, right? And this is something that I tried very hard to get a frequently asked question together before the release of the report that would provide advice, right? What method should you use to go from 2000 to 2020, for example? And frankly, the tech report authors could not come to agreement about the best way to do it. I am still working on that, so I hope that we will be able to provide some guidance there shortly. The challenge is that if you use a long-term tide gauge record, and get an average rate of rise, right, and figure out how much has happened in the last 20 years, that average rate doesn't necessarily capture the recent acceleration that we're seeing. And so some folks feel as if you should use that extrapolated odds to help with correction, but not everyone agrees. So it's still a hot topic of debate, but thank you for raising. It's always good for me to be able to go back and say, we really must do this because this is the need on the ground. So thank you.
Excellent.
I think Jason's got a very good point. I mean, if you think about the sea level curve that you're projecting, it's really going from way back in the past to the future. And we're just talking about where do you put that curve through zero? It's just the tide gauge datum problem, Jason, you're probably familiar with. I don't see why you shouldn't be able to just simply ask people to pick your 0 year. It shouldn't be that difficult. In terms of projecting the tide gauge records, that's very uncertain. I wouldn't do it that way. Just 2 cents worth, Jason.
All right, no, that's good input, Gary. And of course, as you know, pulling the most current tide gauge records is also something that requires a little extra effort. And looking at the tidal datums published, they're also based on a former epoch, and we have to update that as well. So yeah, it's something that we're all spending a lot of time doing, and anything that I guess this group can do to help standardize that and get the most current data out there, I think that'll be helpful. So thank you, Gary.
Actually, that's a good point you make, Jason. I do think it is the datum problem essentially. And I'll definitely put that in front of my work group for the Flood Hub assessment.
Excellent, Chad.
Gary, just a question, Gary. I thought, and I'm sorry if this was mentioned today, but I thought a couple of years ago we were talking about a new tidal epoch datum coming soon. Isn't it due around 2020?
Yeah, I don't know offhand, Libby, if it's out or not. The point Jason's making, though, it doesn't really matter which datum you use as long as you can convert to what it is today. So if we use NavD, anyway, I don't think the new datum will solve his problem, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Jason, would you agree?
Well, I think you pointed it out correctly, Gary. It's a multi-step problem, right? And we have to kind of tackle each of the steps independently. So yeah, we're making the best do with the information available, but and I know it's an evolving science, so we're just going to continue to work together and make it better.
Okay.
Appreciate the attendance by our private sector partners on this, because this is really, you guys are doing a lot of the vulnerability analysis for the local governments that are funded through DEP or DEO or some other things. So I think having these kind of high level or in-depth technical discussions about recommendations and parameters to ensure that there is consistency to the extent that we can. I know there's a lot of different specialized modeling that different agencies and firms do. So it's a bit over my, science depth here. So I want to see, let's put this as a giant thing to figure out, how does the coalition with CSAP need to convey on this in the goals of the regional action plan, which is a draft. There's a lot of desire for increased consistency on a variety of metrics, methodologies, and continuing forward, and then a lot of goals and actions relating to community vulnerability assessments. So, you know, having local government jurisdictions next door to each other using consistent methodologies is going to be, you know, it's important, and that's why we had this meeting. So I want to shift to Brandon Johnson. You've got your hand raised. Thank you so much for attending. What would you like to ask?
Hi, I think this is a message for Gary. It might be one of the subsequent working groups, but can you speak to how the Florida Flood Hub will incorporate precipitation data? You know, I understand that this is, we're focused on sea level rise aspects today, but you know, in our region and in a lot of places along the Gulf Coast, the sea level rise is a means for that plug for runoff. You know, we don't have a lot of elevation change, and our flooding issues can come, you know, top down in that sense from precipitation. So wondering how that will be incorporated and something I see as exacerbating some of the issues we have with our infrastructure and things we have in place to deal with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You put your finger right on a very, very hard problem. The rainfall is one of the most difficult things to downscale in a model, whether it's a climate model or a weather model. And our radar things, they look great, but they don't actually have enough resolution either to really do this. And when you're talking about trying to project over the next decade or 2 decades how it might change, I think the thing that we're going to look at first is there is some hope for projecting it based on the temperature increase that you expect, because the rainfall rate the maximum rainfall rate you can get has a relationship with the temperature of the air, you know, because of the humidity effect. So, and we can project temperature much better than we can project rainfall, if you follow what I mean. So that would be what I would look at first. And I agree with you 100% that the extreme rainfall events and the stormwater runoff, that's a big flooding risk that we have to deal with as well. When Tropical Storm Zeta went by, we heard a lot about the storm surge. There was more out on the beaches. In my neighborhood, the water was higher in the street in front of me than on my seawall in my backyard. And that was because of the rainfall rate. And we had a number of houses flooded in Shore Acres, I'm convinced, due to the rain, not the sea level. So you're right, it's a very, very important problem, and we will look at it. It's definitely on our radar, but in terms of how to do it, I'm not sure that anybody knows the answer to that yet. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful than that.
All right, it's
I think you made a good point. You know, I think I heard something at the BASIS conference last week that, you know, our BMPs are usually designed to meet the average flows, and extreme events are what can get us. And as those extreme events become more common, that's where we have to reevaluate some of our infrastructure issues. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
okay. So I know they've covered a lot of topics and specific questions, and we can ask all kinds of things. So now's the time to really say, as coalition members within your own local government. So thinking about the staff or your other departments, and this is also for all of our other collaborators at different agencies, you know, what kind of information, I know I'm very excited to get the guide that will come out from NOAA after this. Heidi, what was the time frame about getting the sort of the guide?
I think we're probably about 2 months out.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So getting the guide, and then getting by July, then the state level components. There's some additional work that, you know, we can be doing in between now and then to really look at how are we going to think about this. So a lot of the conversation over the last year and a half is taking any sea level rise curve and figuring out when and how to use it and what your timeframes are, right? So that's one of the things that using a risk-based scenario for planning A lot of conversations around what does that mean, looking at the lifespan of this specific infrastructure asset, looking at the criticality, the impacts to something. So now is the time for you to just say, I wish I had this, it would make my job easier, or it would help me to explain to other folks. So, we don't want to keep you on if you don't want to ask questions, but now this is really where we'd like to understand, where can we go next? What do you think would be helpful for you? And this is where, whether it comes through a collaboration with CSAP, other scientific associations, components. I think about how to help. Originally, we had several elected officials who had signed up for this webinar. I know we'll have questions about it. So very interested in hearing your thoughts.
I guess to add to CJ's question, kind of if you want to say, are you using sea level rise projections right now in your work? Are you applying them to like engineering or developing projects or coastal projects for cities? And if so, which sea level rise recommendations are you using? And did you choose them, because CSAP recommended them, or because someone else came in and said, these are what we're going to use? And, is anyone chomping at the bit to get like these new projections, or you all feel like what we've laid out today sounds good and you'll continue to work with the projections you have, for 6+ months until we get the flood hub report and reanalyze it with the CSAP? So just in general, yeah, what kind of, I know Dave Tomasco has shared before how he's utilized the sea level rise projection. So I'm sure some others out there.
Yeah. Ed Sherwood, please welcome, and thanks for coming in, and let us, what's your question?
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, I think I'm very impressed with all the tools that have been developed, and I'm a data geek. I like looking at graphs, but the translation of a lot of that information to elected officials and decision makers, I think is still somewhat lacking. So I don't know if it's through this body or the Florida Flood Hub, but more practical tools that could be provided to elected officials that, to a certain degree, makes the science more accessible, I think is important. So, I would love to see those sort of things come out through this collaboration, because there's a lot of nuance in what was discussed, depending on the gauge you're talking about and what scale is being discussed, either internationally, nationally, state, or locally. So I would love to see more distilled science products relayed to our electeds and decision makers from the new science that has been developed, and I would love to see that happen.
So distilled science products for the elected officials about the new changes, the new science that's behind the reports. Is that part of it? I just want to make sure I paraphrased you correctly. It didn't.
Correct. Yeah, sorry. I'm muting and unmuting from my phone.
No, thanks, Ed. I think this is great. Yeah, understanding the behind the scenes, like what's making the changes, really important, and we can certainly, if it's in the guide or we need to be working on those things. It can be contentious if we talk about contributions, what's going to happen, what's slow or fast. I think one of our, I've been given some really strong messages from our coalition, our elected leaders, is that how do we start working together to address the problems that we are going to face, whether it's X inches or X plus 10 inches. And that's really where I think a lot of local governments are at, is to try to understand, what do you do and how are we planning? We've been working with the Hillsborough County and the Hillsborough Planning Commission, and actually Allison Ye really leading a great project several years ago to update the long range transportation plan, which is looking at 25 years out, right? So we have to have good numbers, good enough to make planning decisions that can then direct strategies and budgets. I think that's the critical factor. How bad will it get? So anyway, I'm off on I was just very, always super impressed with the work that Hillsboro's doing, as well as other counties right now with different initiatives. Tom Rees, thank you for coming here. You have a question or recommendation? Please share it.
I just wanted to say that what Libby was talking about,
Can you get close to your mic, Tom? It's hard to hear you.
Is that any better?
Yes, much better.
Oh, sorry. Hey, I just wanted to comment on what Libby had said that, as practitioners trying to come up with designs, it's really important to have this best data you have, right? We do not want to under-design any of these. The last thing we need is failing living shorelines. But at the same time, you don't want to over-design because it's very costly to over-design. So having some of these updated projections are really helpful for us to inform our designs so that they're going out to the year time period that we want to and are not over designed but are going to work. So I really appreciate these tools and the latest information on this, and just want to say that for us in this industry, these are invaluable.
Thanks, Tom. We appreciate that. So and I want to talk about a little bit about folks who are in the midst of their vulnerability assessments for funding from the DEP things. Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has a project, one's called Safe Shelter. It'll be looking at risks to buildings that are currently shelters and future prospective shelters. So we're going to continue to produce data based on, the defined categories from the statute and the direction that we've received from FDP. We'll keep you posted on that. We will still be releasing the new collaboration flood hazard mapping tool that is developed for affordable housing. That will be using the 2017 curves, and that has already been released. And then we have a webinar on that in just 3 weeks to sit down and really provide a great training background on how you pull down the data. Where the keys are, the assets are there. They're going to get wet. They may get less wet or they may get more wet, depending on the time frame and the scenario you look at. And so this is, I think all of us will be working together over the next 9 months to finish these current round of vulnerability assessment reports. And then once they're done and we have more specific direction on changes and the updates, I would imagine we'll have to figure out what is a good method and process for how do we reevaluate what we thought was that and where's going forward. So I don't know if the scientists on the call have a thought about how we can take what we were learning today in the next few months with these vulnerability assessments for different critical infrastructure and different assets. How is there can we develop a consistent process for re-looking at these things once we have a more solid set of inches or scenarios, whatever we're going to have out of the summer. And that may be a wrong way to approach it, but we're going to end up with lots of lists of, summaries and data sets of things that were at a certain level of risk under these past scenarios. So how are we thinking about this going forward? How should we have another work group to convene to get that together?
So CJ, one thing comes to mind that one of the big changes in the past 5 years from the 2017 to the 2020 report was the narrowing of the projections. And that goes right to what I think it was Tom Rees was saying, is that, we know there's a range, but the narrower the range that we have to plan for, the better we can make sure that we're not underdoing or overdoing. And so the science is improving fast enough that we can expect that range to continue to narrow, especially on the 20 to 30 year sort of time horizon. So as I mentioned, the Flood Hub is not a one and done thing. We'll be continuing to update and following the literature and seeing about, I think the thing that we might be able to attack in a reasonable way is that range that we're talking about. And so how does the 2050 range hold up? I think that might help answer Tom's question in a way. In terms of how to set up a process to do that, I'm not sure about that. I'm just saying that my group can probably help with some of the information on it, since we'll be doing it prior to the 5-year cycle of the National Climate Assessment. Just an offer to help, actually.
Thanks. We want help. Everybody, and actually, there's some really incredibly smart people on this call. I'm going to suggest, everyone's got some pretty, not everyone, but many local governments have really good maps already up, flood education tools and resources for different stakeholders for different areas. I knew the project Leah Harper in Manatee County worked on. This was an early peril of flood, 2019 when we worked together in Manatee, and Jerry Murphy and their mapper, which at the time, I think we just set heights and numbers, right? We didn't say what scenario it was. We just went through, and it's maybe the old school way, but in a way it helps keep people understanding what does it mean by 1 foot or 8 inches or 5 feet, right? And so then there's ways to educate people about the heights without tying in certain timeframes. I don't know. I just always thought Leah did a great job with the mapping of their critical assets and social vulnerability. So other folks' thoughts, recaps?
This is Brandon again. I just wanted to make a comment, kind of a follow-up to what Tom and Ed both said. Tom's point about designing, getting the right science to support that. And then to Ed's point about communicating, having tools that communicate well to elected officials, I think just as important is information that communicates well to regulators as well, because each of these projects need permits, and being able to recognize the value of using these good data tools in the designs. And, as with zoning for a municipality, as with regulations, there's always a lag from regulations, from laws, from the science, but that's, I think, very important, as Tom pointed out, in similar message as Ed was pointing out to elected officials.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have just, about 10 minutes left before the end of the time frame. I know that sometimes it takes a while for, this stuff to really filter in and percolate, but I want to ask our coalition members, local governments, have you had staff meetings? Has anybody had any staff meetings to discuss this? Or are they things that will be coming up at some point? How are you guys looking at this new information yourselves? You're waiting for us to serve up some really cool stuff?
Well, I guess, CJ, that makes me think about which cities and counties are kind of getting together in terms of having like a climate or resiliency group. I know Manatee County does, and so I'm not sure who's on the call here if they want to answer that question, but yeah, hopefully with the survey we'll capture that too. Like, are people meeting in the regular department meetings and all talking about sea level rise, which would be great, or have they assigned, a smaller group that's kind of the climate and sea level rise task force, which then makes it kind of hard to infiltrate into all the departments.
Yeah, I think that's what Alan, thank you for raising your hand. Please share your thoughts on, interdepartmental knowledge sharing or what you might need.
Sure, can you hear me? Yeah, so in Pasco County, we still have an ad hoc group of people in the county. We do not have a resilience officer or a position like that, but we have a number of people across the different branches of our county government that are involved, especially as we start up work on our Resilient Pasco project that we got the grant for last year. That's happening. We're moving forward on that. We greatly appreciate the technical tools, and we will probably take both Gary and Heidi up on their offers that I heard today about chatting about different aspects, whether it's land motion or demos on the tools that Heidi was showing us earlier. But also, as you know, some of you know, you've heard me talk about it before, we would very much appreciate the tools for talking with our elected officials. The key takeaways that Heidi had in her presentation, for example, you know, something that's just really boiled down, you know, something that can be put on, I hate to say it, but something that can be put on one page. Or if you want to send, or for example, if you want to send me a PowerPoint presentation, if it's more than 3 slides, forget it. That's the kind of distillation we need for our elected officials. So that previous comment, I forget who that was. Was that Ed? I can't remember who it was. That was on target. But what discussions are we having in Pasco? Yeah, we're still starting. We're getting to the point now where the engineers who work on our stormwater projects are aware of it and they're looking at it. Our county administrator showed we do a every other week team leader meeting. He showed a TED talk yesterday that it leaned heavily in the sustainability direction. Interesting, you know, taking the long view as opposed to short-term view. So, you know, my intention is to play off of that. But where are we? We're still getting started on a vulnerability assessment. So
yeah, you have an interesting opportunity since you haven't yet, the question is what years you use. So we're happy to follow up with you on that. I know we already suggested we might. So Ashley Painter Olsmar, thank you for Alan, thank you for your comments. Ashley.
Okay, so I'll say we've done the resiliency plan and we have, it is in most of our planning, some form of storm surge, sea level rise is now a part of it. I can't speak for Pinellas County itself, but I know that we do have a group of the sustainability coordinators and those working in the field in the county that do meet regularly. And this is something that's a topic that's being brought up amongst all of us and kind of trying to get on the same page as to what we all want to do so that, like, you know, Oldsmar's not doing one thing and then the county's doing one thing and then Largo's doing something different, kind of in our heads. If we can get the municipalities to kind of have a general, at least the same, you know, take or wording or whatever message that we're putting out, then it will be easier for us to get, you know, elected officials on board or the county or every, you know, if we're all doing not the same thing, but similar and moving towards the same goals.
Thank you, Ashley. So your vulnerability assessments, I believe you guys have a WSP as a subcontractor doing that work, or am I confused?
We did have WSP did our vulnerability assessment. We obviously did not use the newest data because it was done last year.
Exactly.
Yes, and they are the same ones that did the modeling for the county.
Correct. So one of the things I'm going to throw out is that we might, among the coalition members, send me or Karen, I can post a thing and that everybody identifies those who are where we're at with our vulnerability assessments and who were the subcontracted firms on those vulnerability assessments. And then we potentially can do a follow-up on aspects of consistency, because I know there was a lot of projects going to be completed in the next, I don't know, 6 months to a year with the FDP funding on that. So Ely, glad you could join us. You have some comments or thoughts to share for us.
Yeah, thank you for having this great forum here. So one of the things that we hear constantly from a number of our clients is some of the discussion that we're having here, which is what are the regulations or what are the code or how should we design our projects to account for sea level rise in the absence of any unified regulations out there. And one of the things that we have been trying to talk to the water management district about, in this case is SwiftMud, is to actually take a leading role in setting up those regulations. Everything else that we design, whether it's a development, whether it's a road widening, a bridge, or any other a park, we have state ERP regulations that we have to follow, and then the county, the city, or any other local agency have to have their own regulations that are kind of built upon that in one way or another. So, so the point here is that we encourage the local governments that are on this call and that are having those discussions with the water management district to actually echo those sentiments and then push them towards working to include them in their regulations. For a number of years, we simply asked them to at least include them in their watershed management plans. Some of at the time they were saying, well, we looked for the local governments to do that, but now they're actually asking for it. So it's a slow turning ship, but I think that would be a good place to start to have a unified code for everybody to follow.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, uniformity, consistency, super important. We have a few more minutes. Anybody? Hi, Lisa Foster. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there. I just want to follow up on what Eli said. You know, he's got a really good point. There's policy and then there's regulation. And I think this needs to be broken out into several sort of compartments. We've got sea level rise that we're going to be needing to look at for super vulnerable areas. That's going to be the baseline for any storm surge, for any storm events that goes over that. And it's also going to impact, obviously, that groundwater, and that's going to impact how we do our stormwater regulations in a lot of these areas. Second to that is where we put things, right? So more of the comprehensive planning piece of it. You know, where do we want to redevelop? How do we want to redevelop it? Where are we going to put certain things? And then how do we want to build those? We're using current or backward looking, if you're talking about the FEMA map, data for the storm surge for these base flood elevations. You know, do we want to look at the life expectancy of the building, right? So say the building should last 50 years. So do we want to look 50 years into the future, even though the data gets kind of, you know, iffy, and just use an intermediate level and say, well, that's our best guess and it's better than putting an arbitrary freeboard on something for the elevation. And then flood proofing, and then further inland, of course, you get the precipitation, which is another animal altogether. So it almost needs to be compartmentalized, but that policy needs to turn into regulatory language or it's not going to be effective.
It's a multi-year, multi-step process, right? So thank you for sharing. Do you think that we can work within the region on these issues of policy and then getting to regulation, or do you see this more really coming together to have common information and then, you know, so how, imagine like there's willingness to make these updates and do these things, you know, what do you think should be some of the key steps for the counties to get together, then the cities? There's somebody on the who has a phone hand.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, well, just some thoughts.
So my thoughts are, first, we need the data, and Pinellas County has the countywide vulnerability assessment. And from that data, you know, we can implement policies, and some of the municipalities have gone in tandem with the county and adopted the best available data, and others have not. So there's got to be that sort of understanding across all of the local governments, not only just within Pinellas County, but within the whole region. So you need Hillsborough County, Pasco County, and maybe even Manatee County on board with this idea, this sort of vision for the region. How do we want to move forward? And then after you figure out how you want to move forward, that's where you can maybe have an a la carte, you know, at a bare minimum, you do this. And if you really want to be proactive, you can do, you know, C, D, or E. But I think the data is the bottom line. First, we need to get the data. We need to understand the data. We need to make the elected officials understand the data. That's huge. And I saw that in the chat. I mean, everybody's reiterated that through this whole conversation.
Okay, thank you. I see a phone that has a hand raised. Is there somebody who hasn't spoken yet that would like to?
Commissioner Williams with the city of Palmetto.
Oh, fantastic.
I would say that one of the things as far as an elected official that we need someplace that we can go to, like a SharePoint, to collect information, see information that other communities are doing. And I have not seen that, to where I don't know what Polk County's doing or what some of the other cities that are around me, what they're doing. I'm following sea level rise, but I just don't have a place to go to know where people are at and how I can impress my community, my county, of where we need to be going on this. I know the county is moving on it, but I don't have the pool or a place to go to where I can find out what everybody else is doing.
Well, thank you for participating today. We're, really pleased that you could take the time from your schedule to listen into this, and that is the role of, there's a number of folks that we can connect you with. So I would be delighted to reach back out to you, sir, and then we can begin a plan, because the summit, which will be coming up shortly, is a great way to hear and learn more about that on April 5th and 6th. We'll send this out. Some of the counties, there is a lot of information that has been out there. So it's a question of how to get to it, how to understand what it is we need to look at for what questions we have. So thank you for your time and participation today. And we'll look for, or you can send me an email. Everybody pretty much knows me, but I'm going to put my email in the chat. And then you can send me and Kara. We will be listening to this and taking notes. We have a number of staff who are also participating, Alana, Sarah, our NAS fellow, Matt Varkany. So there's a lot of commitment from the Regional Planning Council to keep figuring out how we can take the information that comes in and develop it so it's useful for different audiences. So from natural resources planning, what does it mean when the sea moves up into buildings and housing and other risk factors? So if you have any last comments or chats, you can put them into the chat. You can also send me or Kara information. We will make a giant list of things that came out of this, and we will get this posted. I just want to say thank you again to our facilitators and knowledge sharers, Libby and Maya, and also to Heidi and Gary for pulling together the presentation, sharing their thoughts on this. And for all of you who, do this day in and day out, thanks for the work that you're doing, man. And man, that's my Chicago time, ladies, gentlemen, I'm not very gender individual here. So the whole point of it is all of the work that all of you are doing, you help us make it all get better and better. So feel free to keep sharing your knowledge with the Regional Planning Council so we can gain more information about best practices and or key needs in communications. So and if you know people who weren't able to get in because this was unfortunately capped, we will be posting this. And if we need to do a repeat, series, maybe we can convince our speakers to do another version of it. Seems like there was way more people who couldn't get in that and really wanted to. Thanks for your time, everyone, and have a great Friday and a nice weekend as well.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of the weekend. Thank you, CJ.